Katie Gentili. I'm a professor in counseling and gender studies and the director of the Women's Center, which means we're extra happy to have you here. I've assigned some readings by Helen Benedict to my class. I was telling my class I hope they come because it's very exciting to host both of you. Also because I've been doing a lot of research on the cultural kind of construction of women's bodies and the fetish of babies since 9/11 and in times of war. So this is very much obviously into my research, so I'm very excited to have you guys here. So this is about challenging the masculinity of war, which is tough at John Jay because John Jay is historically a school of criminal justice, historically a school of police officers. The NYPD is organized as a paramilitary organization. So I think it's extremely important that we're hosting this, as well as extremely challenging that we're hosting this. So, but hey, that's what the Women's Center is all about. So I will cede the floor now to Deborah Sweet, who's going to introduce the authors. Thank you for coming. And they do have books I really highly recommend. I'm sure she's going to say reading them, especially if you're in the military or in the NYPD or going into the criminal justice system, because gender is central. And remember, we have a gender studies major and minor.
Well, we're here today to grapple with some really big and important ideas, and I really appreciate what Katie had to say about that. It is challenging. There's a big mission before those of us who care about humanity. My organization, World Can't Wait, is dedicated itself to the mission of stopping the crimes of our government, principally being carried out on other people in the form of occupation and torture going on in the Middle East right now. And in that process, we are accustomed to dealing with big and important ideas, and we feel it's incredibly important that as we're trying to change the world, we really think about relationships between people. And so we have never forgotten that women are oppressed on this globe, and that has a big part in figuring into why there are these wars of occupation and how they're carried out. So I am so pleased today that we have two authors who I believe have done really important work on these questions. They're going to speak to you one at a time, and then they're going to talk to each other for a little while and open up the discussion for all of us. First, Kathy Berry will speak, and she's someone that I've met in the course of an email relationship over several years in opposing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She's based in California, although she has taught all over the world and worked all over the world against female sexual trafficking. In fact, she wrote the seminal book that brought this as even a question into academia back in 1978. And I'd really encourage you all to look at that book. It's still in print. Today we have her current and new book, Unmaking War, Remaking Men, which she's principally going to be talking about today. And then directly after Kathy, Helen Benedict, who teaches here at the Columbia School of Journalism, is going to speak principally about her book, The Lonely Soldier, The Private War of Women Serving in Iraq. And this book is not only a book, but it's been made into a play featuring the real lives of women who have served in Iraq. And if you ever have a chance to see it or bring it to John Jay, this would be a wonderful thing for the Women's Studies Center to do. Helen is grappling with big ideas as well about how women are treated in the US military. All of this, I think, in the service of making the world a better place, not only for women, but of course for humanity, because that would be the point of a world that we would all want to live in. So I hope you'll have a chance to read the books, think about these questions, and check out the material at the back of the room from World Can't Wait. This event is also sponsored by Code Pink, which does very important work against military recruiting and against drone bombings and and for stopping the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and On the Issues magazine, and of course the department here at John Jay, and we really thank you for hosting this. So, Kathy.
For sure.
Doesn't want to obscure your face.
Yeah.
There.
I don't touch these things because they all go wrong
That's
when
okay.
when I put my
We
hands
got it.
on
Got it. I think
Is
we're
this
good.
it? So, I think a place I want to start is to say how, first of all, really pleased and honored I am to be sharing the podium and the program today with Helen Benedict, whose work is so extraordinary, especially on women soldiers. But more than that, but in addition to that, not more than that, in addition to that, I was thinking as Deborah was introducing what it was like, you can tell from my hair, back in the 60s in the anti-war movement when we didn't have a Code Pink or a World Can't Wait as a reference point for our actions, where feminism was almost, in many cases, an enemy to some of the male leftists of the anti-war movement. And what a struggle that was for us now. And now, even as I was writing this book, and I'm sure Helen has had the same experience, having the work of Code Pink and World Can Wait going on while you're being a feminist yourself, writing about war, it really is a changed world. So we're going to push that change a little bit further. The title of my book is meant for us to look to a new future, to look to unmaking war and to remaking men. So there's an optimism in that I hope that we can get to in our discussions. But let's start with the problem, the masculinity of war. And I want to start by talking about, for just a second, talking about the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Convention is the international law governing war. Now, let's be clear, most nations don't obey the Geneva Conventions in war, in combat. But nevertheless, this is the international law governing war that says that those who are not engaged in hostilities are to be protected during war, in a war zone. Those who are not engaged in hostilities are referred to otherwise as civilians or innocent lives or women, children, and the elderly, any number of terms that go along with that. It occurred to me as I hadn't even yet begun to think about writing this book, but as I was following some of the things going on with war, it occurred to me that as soon as we identify a class of human beings who are not to be killed in war, we have immediately identified a class of human beings who are killable, who are to kill and who are killable. That is the work of war. It is the function of the military. Beginning and end of story. Whatever else is said about it, that is the basis of it. The Geneva Convention didn't come about just from a group of men sitting around thinking about how to legalize war, because that's in fact what it does. It assumes, the Geneva Conventions assume that war is inevitable, and therefore it should be fought under certain conditions that protect certain human beings, leaving another class of human beings, those who are killable, as excluding them from even human rights. Among the human rights codified by the United Nations is the right to live. the right to not be killed. Soldiers in combat, those engaged in hostilities, whether it is a militia, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah on one hand, or the U.S. military on the other hand, these are people whose lives have been excluded from human rights, which is in itself a violation of human rights. In other words, the Geneva Convention actually violates international human rights law. And this is, but it's not simply, as I started to say, a group of men sitting around thinking about how to codify war and determine what's legal and not legal. These laws reflect our norms, our values, and the beliefs of our societies and our states around the world. They're not just the assumption, for example, that war is inevitable is a fairly basic belief that people have, almost simply because it's rarely ever been questioned. It's rarely ever been thought, it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, we don't even need to have militaries, but I'm getting ahead of my point. I have to work up to that a little bit. So the masculinity of war, and as we know, and as Helen Benedict will amply show us, also includes women, not only women in the military and in war zones, but women who have ended up in combat even though they're not legally assigned combat at this point in time. But the model is a masculinity of war. And that masculinity of war we see crossing every culture, every state, every race, every ethnicity, every national origin. It's a social construct of masculinity that in this book I refer to as core masculinity. Recognizing that there's a huge diversity among men, just as there's a huge diversity among women, we also see that there's a very core set of expectations from the society, from the state, about what it means to be a man and how to be a man. Now, men will have a variety of ways of responding to that expectation. But if you don't do it the way it's supposed to be done, that is with violence and aggression, then your very manhood is in question. And so that makes this kind of masculinity a social construct. I'm not talking about anything that comes from testosterone or Y chromosomes or any of these other things. It's a construct of the society to feed the military in order to feed wars. And so as I was looking at what I began to call core masculinity, I heard this same thing in different countries that I was in while I was writing this book of, for example, in Palestine and the occupied territories, I was talking with a director of men's violence against women project, who was talking to me about how Palestinian men do not like to use the word occupation. They do not like to refer to themselves as being occupied. Now, this is men in everyday life. When you look at the Palestinian leadership, when you look at the movement of Palestinian peoples, of course it's an understanding that they're occupied. But men in everyday life, to say I am occupied is to say that I do not have the power to protect my family. I cannot protect my daughter, my son, my wife, my community. I have no power to stand between the aggressor and these people who are dear to me. That protector role, I began to see, was underlying the violence and aggression of what I'm calling core masculinity. If you are assigned the role of, if you men are assigned the role of protecting us women, you got to have tools to do that. And just going around being sweet and lovely may not help you when push comes to shove. So the protector role requires violence and aggression. And as many of us women know, men then also turn that violence and aggression on us. So that protector role cuts both ways. Women who are suffering violence and have to call the police and are waiting for a policeman to come to the home know that they are relying on somebody to come and protect them. One man protecting them from another man. That's the patriarchal structure around this masculinity of war. It is from this protector role and through this notion that is encoded in the Geneva Conventions that I came to understand men's core masculinity as building in men expendable lives. I never thought when I was 14 or 11 or 7 that I would ever have to kill anyone, that I would ever have to beat up anybody. But my brothers, we were watching the same movies on television. My brothers were seeing as role models for them, you know, the shoot 'em up, bombing the villages guys, and learning that this may be an expectation of them, that they might actually not live past their 19th birthday. And so it raised for me the question, and I think it's a question. It's not one I'm here to answer. It's one I'm here to ask us to ask of ourselves and ask of the men that we know and the boys that we know. How do you grow up in a developmental sense from boy to manhood, knowing that your lives might be expendable? How do you live day by day in the military, knowing that every day that you go out on maneuvers, you may not come back? And that is an everyday reality for soldiers in combat. This expendability of men, which is extended now to women, is what the military relies on. Just as it relies on our economy crashing and people needing jobs and thinking that they can get earn a living by going into the military, it relies on this socialization of the masculinity of war. It sets, particularly boys becoming men, but also then some women who are turning in this direction. It sets them up. They're ready for basic training. They're ready to learn how to kill. And when they get in the military, they're ready to know that by the time they're through basic training and they're going into combat, that their work is they're professionals. They're professional killers, is what they are. But taking them to the target range and teaching them how to shoot rifles or how to, shoot off missiles and drop bombs is not the core of making a killer in the U.S. military. The core of making a killer in the U.S. military is of making a buddy for every soldier. Every soldier has this buddy. All of them are buddies with each other. and you get this buddy here, and you've got his back, and it is your job to make sure that nothing happens to him, that he gets to go home alive, that he stays safe. This soldier is your buddy. He's got your back, and it's his job to make sure, and on and on and on, until you get linked in this responsibility for each other, for preventing each other from getting killed. That's how you make killers. Because if this guy gets killed, it's my fault. I'm not a man. I haven't stood up to this. I am responsible, and likely with my buddies I will go on a revenge attack, which we've seen so much of. Fallujah, Haditha, places like this in Iraq. What we have in this situation then is, for the most part, normal human beings, usually young people, 17, 18, 19, usually looking for a way to get money for college or just a way to get some income, being forced to behave as if they are sociopaths, remorseless, with no empathy, with no caring. And when they get into the combat zone, excuse me, when they get in the combat zone, who they kill is anyone who is not their buddy. That's how they determine who the enemy is. There was not a ready-made group of insurgents in Iraq waiting to kill American soldiers when the U.S. invaded Iraq. The U.S. had to go in and make enemies to kill in order to do this. And so and soldiers will say this quite freely: I am there to protect my buddy and to get out alive if I can. Anybody who is not one of us is the enemy. And that's why there's no real, actual distinction between civilian and soldiers in terms of who is targeted in a war zone. That's the reason why. I want to shift now quite abruptly, because our time is limited and I want you to be able to hear all that Helen has to say, to the way that I have thought about getting out of this. Because we cannot allow the Pentagon and the White House to be defining our future for us, to defining what the world is going to look like in 10, 20, or 30 years. And so that's what we as feminists have always been good at doing, looking at the future and saying, this is what we don't want, and this is what we want. And now we're going to find ways to go for it. I looked at this in my book in two levels. One in terms of the state, and one the other is at the individual level. In terms of the state, I propose a plan for demilitarization of all nation states. Can you imagine no military in the United States? Let me rephrase that. Imagine no military in the United States. That's the way we have to go at it. Costa Rica has no military. Since 1947, when they had a horribly bloody coup, and many, many Costa Ricans were slaughtered in this coup, the response of the new president, now get this in terms of how different it was from President Bush's response to 9/11. The response of the new president was, we are never going to have a war like this again, therefore I am eliminating the military. See the difference then from Bush's response to the attack and 9/11? It's a shift in a paradigm. It's a looking at it in an entirely different way. There are ways that we can go about doing this. I've developed some of them in the book, but there are also international organizations working on what a world would look like with a demilitarization. But the other problem, the wonderful thing about Costa Rica is that it's a demilitarized state. The thing that really threw me when I went there, because you have to get on the ground and see these things when you're writing about them, was that 60% of all Costa Rican women will experience violence from men in their lifetime. Clearly, unmaking war did not stop violence against women. It did not cut into the violence of masculinity. It is turned even more fully on women in the home. Wonderful President Oscar Arias, a woman has replaced him whose name I shouldn't have forgotten, have wonderful, fantastic laws in place, but still this huge rate of violence against women. We do not get peace by ending war. By ending a war, we get an interim state between this war and the next war. We get peace by remaking men and changing the gender divisions that we have in our society. I want to end with just this statement and say to you that as I was writing the last chapter of this book, I was in the middle of the last chapter and I'm going, oh God, I'm writing about remaking men, and who are they? Where are my models for men who have changed their masculinity? And even though I was really tired and actually very grumpy that day, I went to the Peace and Justice Center in Santa Rosa because a couple of veterans who had been traveling around the country were there. And they started to tell their stories. And they were resistors. One resisted while he was in the war, the other became a veteran against the war. And as they told the story of how they step by step, incrementally, started to break away from the expectations of both, they didn't say masculinity, but that's what it was, from both the masculinity and the requirements of the military, you could see in them their remaking of themselves. So this is a really important point about remaking men in terms of the focus of my book. This is not another job for women to do. It's one we can encourage and support men doing, but it's not another one that we're going to take on. I approach this then through something that I call the politics of empathy. And indeed, in terms of even figuring out what's happening to men in combat, it required of me a kind of empathy that I knew was there once it came out, let's put it that way. Men, it's not enough to ask soldiers to refuse to kill others. Men must insist on their humanity if they are to regain their will to live in our shared human consciousness, and to refuse to allow their own lives or the lives of any men to be rendered expendable. Self-respect in human interaction is where men will find the strongest, most powerful, most valid basis to stop tolerating the killing of others. Men, we ask you not to refuse to kill that human being because she is a child or because she is a woman. If those are your reasons, then killing men is still acceptable, and women and children will still be your unavoidable collateral damage in your fighting. Decide not to kill those women and children because you are a human being and recognize them in your humanity. Then you can recognize other men, not as expendable lives, but through your own humanity. We cannot fully value any human life as long as that of our own, our brothers, our fathers, husbands, sons, and now also our daughters, mothers, sisters' lives are devalued, expendable everywhere, in Palestine, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, Iraq, the United States, Rwanda, Australia, Lebanon, China, Tibet. It's a global problem that requires global solutions and an individual remaking of human beings. Women have to let go of the expectation of being protected, as men have to let go of the violence and aggression that promotes their protector role. Helen?
Thanks everybody for coming. I have to say first that I'm thrilled to be here and to be speaking with Kathy, who is an early role model of mine. When I was a graduate student, I read Female Sexual Slavery and said, that's the kind of book I want to grow up to write. I'm not surprised that it's still in print and has continued to be extremely important. Are there any veterans here today in the room? And anybody who has family in the military? Okay, I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for coming. I started this book, The Lonely Soldier, because when the Iraq War started, I was very upset about it. And I began to follow it first as a protester. And early on, I discovered, I came across a young woman. She was the first female veteran of the Iraq War I'd ever laid eyes on. It was at a small classroom at CUNY. And I went up to her and I said, are you a veteran? Because there were a bunch of veterans talking that day, and she'd been silent in the back of the room. And she said, oh yeah, I was in Iraq for 11 months. I was shot at every night. I was a gunner. But you know what? When I talk about it, nobody listens. And when I try and make them listen, they don't believe me. And you know why? It's because I'm a female. So I said, well, I'll listen. What's it like being a woman in combat? And she said, the first thing you got to understand is that there are only 3 things that guys let you be if you're a girl in the military: a bitch, a hoe, or a dyke. You're a bitch if you won't sleep with them. You're a hoe if you've only got one boyfriend, and you're a dyke if they don't like you. So you can't win. And when I heard that, I thought, wait a minute. We've got young women making all the same sacrifices, putting themselves in all the same danger, life, limb, and peace of mind, taking all the same risks and going into the military for all the same reasons, including economic and family background, which I'll get into in a minute, as men. And they're being treated as nothing but sexual prey. What's going on here? And that's what began my quest. But the other thing I had to deal with is that I had a serious clash going on between myself as my feminist self that believed that women should be able to take any job they want and do anything they damn well want, and my anti-war self, which hated the idea of seeing any young person go to war at all, but especially because of my motherly and maybe patriarchal protective instincts, women. So how do I reconcile these 2 things? I had no idea. So I decided the thing to do was go to the women soldiers themselves and see what they had to say about it. So this all began about a year into the war. I spent about the next 3 years interviewing 40 women who'd served in Iraq from all over the country, all races, all economic walks of life, all different ages, different branches. And I picked 8 of them to visit and spend hours and hours with, and eventually boiled it down to 5. I would go to their homes, I'd meet their families, I'd look at the high schools where they were recruited and sit with them for hours on end, listening and listening and listening. And I realized that women have a different war story to tell than men. Very early on, there was a survey done of the soldiers in Iraq. 80% of the women, this was about 2005, said, "We think we should get out of here within a year." 80% of active duty female soldiers were already turning against the war. This was not widely reported. Among men, it was surprisingly high. It was 69.9%. Something's wrong here. Something's wrong with this war. We shouldn't be here. When I heard that the soldiers themselves were saying this, although anonymously, because they're not allowed to say it out loud, I became very interested in that gap. And why is it that women felt freer to speak out against the war than men, or maybe just felt themselves turn against the war sooner than men? So these were some of the questions I had going in. I'll give you some some basic facts, and then I'll talk about more about the kinds of experiences women had in the war and in the military. About a third of the women I was talking to told me about being raped and sexually assaulted by their fellow soldiers. And all of them, except 2, told me about being constantly, relentlessly sexually harassed by their so-called brothers in arms. Then I went to the statistics, because I only talked to 40, and actually over the years it began to grow more to 50, but still that's not statistically significant. But the Department of Veterans Affairs actually has been studying sexual assault since before Vietnam, and deep in their databases they have fantastic studies and statistics. And in one of them I found a study of women who'd served in the military from the Vietnam War all the way through the war's first Gulf War. 30% said they'd been raped by comrades. That's almost 1 in 3. Other studies, 71% sexually assaulted, 90% sexually harassed. The numbers keep coming out, fresh numbers. The Air Force just admitted its own study done with a Gallup poll, 1 in 5 women in the Air Force raped while serving. I was hearing this from the women themselves. I'll read you some of their words. And this isn't just about rape, but it's about the whole position of women in the military. "I was the only female in my platoon of 50 to 60 men," said Army Specialist Chantel Henneberry. She served in Alaska. "My company consisted of 1,500 men, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and Army, and under 18 women. I was fresh meat to hungry men. The mortar rounds that came in daily did less damage to me than the men with whom I shared my food." Another one, Sergeant Sarah Scully of the Army's 8th Military Police Brigade. She served in Korea. She told me this: "When I got there, I found 2 female soldiers who looked as though they'd been battered mentally. They had the dead eyes of abused women. I learned that one of them had been living by herself with about 30 men, Americans and Koreans, and had to have a guard placed in front of the shower each morning." The third one, Sergeant in the Air Force: "People worry about their loved ones' encounters with the enemy, but for females, sometimes the enemy eats, sleeps, and works right next to them." The isolation that women experience is on several levels. It's not only that they're hugely outnumbered, 14% throughout the military, and in Iraq, 1 in 10 was female, but they're not deployed together. They're deployed according to their job. So Sometimes they're alone, like Chantal Henneberry, or they might be with a handful of 2 or 3 women or less. And at the beginning of the war, they didn't have separate barracks, so they're sleeping in the same tents as the men. And this is really important to remember when you think about the relentless sexual harassment, because it's not like at the office where you can't go home at the end of the day and get away from it and talk to your mother or your sister or your best friend. You have to live with these people 24/7, month after month, sometimes year after year. So they're harassing you constantly, they're outnumbering you. And the harassment, I'm not talking about flirtation, I'm not talking about compliments, I'm talking about demeaning, hate-filled, vulgar, disgusting, brutal, violent language that is thrown at you day in and day out. There's studies that have found that that alone causes as much post-traumatic stress disorder as combat. Some more examples. One of the reasons I wrote this book is I very much wanted to be a conduit between the soldiers and civilians. So I like to use their own words as much as possible. There's a huge culture gap between civilians and soldiers. The military in general regards civilians as not understanding, as soft, safe, blind, ignorant, and fat. These are the things that I've heard them say. And we civilians tend to look at soldiers in one of 2 ways, either as sort of untouchably heroic or as dumb grunts who follow orders and know nothing about anything. Put brutally, but common opinions. And the more soldiers I got to know, as Kathy pointed out, the more complex they are, the more thoughtful I found them to be, and touching. The woman on the cover of my book, Ellie Painted Crow, was in the military for 22 years. She told me, 2 majors and a lieutenant assaulted me when I was serving. Sexual assaults happened to me several times in my 22 years in the military, a couple times that succeeded. I got even with them in my own way, but I never reported them because nobody believes you. So this is another aspect of it. The attitude towards what rape is, and the blame the victim culture in the military. Everything in the military is about, as Kathy described, family, being united, being a tight bunch together. You're never supposed to snitch. You're never supposed to complain to the authorities about each other's behaviors. You're supposed to handle it on your own. Otherwise, you're seen as a traitor. So women who've been sexually assaulted have the pressure of that. They will be seen as a traitor, and they will be treated as a traitor by their fellow soldiers if they report it. On top of it all, the culture in the military, as the culture in our society at large, tends to tell women that they asked for it in some way, that they deserved it, they misjudged something, they took a risk, they were too flirtatious, they got drunk, or that they're just outright lying to bring down a man's career or have revenge or get attention. It goes on and on. This is internalized very fast by women when everyone around you is telling you this. So even the Defense Department's statistics show that they assume that 80 to 90% of sexual assaults are never reported at all. So their statistics only show 10%. So when Ellie said that nobody believes you, she was talking about back in the 1980s, and that hasn't changed. The sad thing is, too, that just to talk a little bit more about the culture of blame and silence, is that when you combine a sexual assault with combat experience, you get a confluence of remorse and self-loathing and self-blame that is very, very destructive to people when they come home. I've heard women tragically say, I did things over there as a soldier that I hate myself for. So I figured this is a karma that I was raped. I somehow deserved it. So I'm not going to seek any help because I'm such a terrible human being, I don't deserve it. I find that very heartbreaking. So let's go on to the other side. Why do soldiers rape? Where does this come from? We know it's a big problem in society. I mean, the FBI says 1 in 6 women will be raped at some point in her life. In the military, nearly 1 in 3 while she's serving. So we can say twice as much in the military. Why? Well, one of the things is this hyper-masculine culture that Kathy talked about. What more masculine job is there in our culture than being a soldier? Even more than being a fireman or a cop. The soldier is the ultimate macho image in our, not just our society. I would like to later talk with Kathy about why masculinity seems to need to define itself as something that's not female and not gay, and is there some way of defining masculinity that isn't against something else, something to talk about. But there are a lot of men in the military who are very threatened and resentful that women are now fighting beside them. Some of them feel emasculated by it. Some of them are convinced that women put them in danger, that they're weak soldiers and not good soldiers, for which, by the way, there's no evidence. Some of them just feel that their old boys club is invaded and the privilege of it is being destroyed. Now, this tends to be a feeling more among the older men. And it is indeed, I should mention, older men who tend to do most of the assaulting and raping. The average age of the victim is 21. The average age of the assailant is 28, and he's usually of a higher rank. So there's also the abuse of power going on there. So we have resentment among some of them. There's something else that's not often said, which is, where do soldiers come from in our voluntary military? What is the background? There were 2 studies, one done in the Marines and one done in the Army, that showed 50% of men who joined the military were physically abused as children. 50% of the women were sexually abused. 6% of the men were also sexually abused. So we have a military, half of whom, at least among the enlisted ranks, join to get away from violent, dysfunctional, abusive homes. They're attracted, men and women, to the military to find a new family, to get out, and also to gain the kind of strength they need, because they've been victimized as children and they want to feel strong so they won't be victimized anymore. But sociologists and psychologists have long traced a pattern that shows that abused boys very often turn into abusive men. Not always, but very often. So you've got that element going on as well. Then, of course, there's societies like, images that we get bombarded by from the minute we're born, images of women as sexual prey. But it's particularly strong in the military. I'm going to read you some examples of that in a minute. There's one other element too, which is, what kind of man wants to be a soldier? Well, aside from those who join because they just have to have an education, that's the only way they can afford it, or they come from a dead-end town, there are men who want to join because they like that hyper-masculine, aggressive role, because they want to fight and kill. Part of what goes on in training in the military is the building of group, and as Kathy pointed out, this bond that goes on about battle buddies. I protect your back, you protect mine, we're family. That's used a lot. Drill sergeants will say, I'm your mother, I'm your father, we're your brothers, we're your new family, forget who you were, we're the family now. As one of the women soldiers in my book said to me, a single soldier is nothing, it's all about the group. I'm just going to read a passage from my book now. It's worth pausing here a moment to ask who exactly this group is. As others have pointed out, a military group defines itself through contempt for and hatred of the enemy. But this enemy is not only, say, Iraqi rebels or the Taliban, it is also the outsider, the soft or nonconformist soldier, and those age-old butts of military contempt, women and homosexuals. Military language reveals this contempt all the time, even with a force that now includes women, gays and lesbians, and rules that now prohibit drill instructors from using racial epithets and curses. Instructors still denigrate recruits with words like pussy, girl, bitch, lady, dyke, faggot, and fairy. The everyday speech of ordinary soldiers is still riddled with sexist and homophobic insults, and soldiers still openly peruse pornography that humiliates women and sing the misogynist songs that have been around for decades. This is my rifle, this is my gun, meaning penis. This is for killing, this is for fun, meaning the gun. Or a marine cadence. Who can take a chainsaw, cut the bitch in two, fuck the bottom half and give the upper half to you? This misogynist language is so deeply ingrained in military culture as to be reflexive. I had a lot of women say they became deaf to it, and it wasn't until they'd been out of the military for a year and then would get together with soldiers and hear that talk that it hit them how it had felt to hear that around them all the time. How eroding of your self-esteem it is. It serves as a constant reminder to women that even as they are winning honors and advancing in numbers and positions in the military, when it comes to groups, they are alone. I'm going to say one more thing about the experience of women in the military that relates very much to, again, what Kathy said about the ring of battle buddies watching each other's backs. When I heard women recount the constant harassment and the endless sexual assaults they were being subject to, I said to them, well, where does this leave you when you're in battle? Where does this leave you when you're in a position where you need that buddy watching your back? And they would say, alone. A lot of them said to me, I didn't trust anybody and I still don't. That's why I call the book The Lonely Soldier. Because the one great compensation of war, and perhaps Kathy's right, this is something that we need to unmake to make war less attractive, but the one great compensation is that band of brothers, that as Shakespeare coined it, that camaraderie, that bond that you form with people when you go through danger with them. It's the thing that veterans always talk about as the most precious thing, and a lot of them talk about never having a relationship that is that strong ever again in their lives. Women are excluded from that. They're always the outsider. Very few of them get that. They're taking all the same risks. They have none of that comfort. And I believe that's one of the reasons why women are more ready to be critical of the war and of the military, because they're not, if you like, brainwashed into loyalty by that bond that makes them fall in love with the other soldiers and fall in love with the military. They're the outsider. They're the reject. So they have a distance, and that's why women tell different war stories than men. So should we sit down? I know a lot of wonderful men who'd never want to kill anybody and hate the idea and also hate the violence in their fellow men, are quite repelled by it, including my lovely son and my husband and most of my friends. But they need to hold on to masculinity, to a certain amount of masculinity. They need to feel like men. They need, otherwise they can't hold their head up, and they feel, emasculated, destroyed, feminized, God forbid. So, do we have to define masculinity as being not a woman?
You know, I was really taken. I so wish we were hanging around with each other while I was writing this book. There's so many places where our work converges. And this was one of those really tough questions that I had to grapple with because I'm trying to write about masculinity, which isn't, I mean, most of my work has been about what men do to women in terms of violence against women. And now I'm looking at men in terms of being made expendable for war. And I hadn't really been that kind in my writing before about it. But what I did think about, and I think right now I'm theorizing or thinking aloud more than offering a precise definition, is this notion of creating the group of killable people, from whether it's from the Geneva Conventions or whether it's just in basic socialization, of boys learning while they're growing up that they could be in war and doing killing and doing ugly, awful things, and that also they're learning that it's fun, of course. And the video games now, that is just a tremendous industry that supports all of this. That underneath that is what I think of as this protector role. What I've seen evidence of anyway is the protector role. I can't help but think that you got to have some kind of anger in yourself if your future is defined in terms of becoming a killer, a high likelihood of being killed, either in protecting your family or in supposedly in the military protecting your country, that there isn't a high degree of anger at those people who cause you to be in this role, which is us, the women and children who have to be protected. And that anger comes out as violence against us, as you well show with the women in the military, as we know of women in families and in the society. But I think it also comes out in this kind of definition of masculinity, which is why this definition is also anti-gay, to the extent that gay men are not into being into the hyper-masculinity. They're part of the problem too. They're they become more like us, the people who have to be protected. And I think there's a lot to this notion. I don't think that it's fully conscious, because I don't think growing up you can afford to know that your life is expendable. You learn it when when you're going into the military. You learn it in basic training, but I don't think you can afford to know it growing up. And so there's a contempt for women, for that which is female, in the very language of emasculation, and or the worst thing that could happen to a man would be to be feminized. That's what's wrong with so many gay men as far as hyper-masculine men go. So that's where I go with thinking about this. Do you have any?
Yeah, I think that's true. Although I'm finding myself a little uneasy here, and I think because I don't like overgeneralizing too much about people. And I mean, there's a lot of, I know a lot of men who played with guns when they were kids and wouldn't dream of going to war if they could help it as adults, and are, total peaceniks. So it's not, not to make it sound like everything that our society has about the role of men necessarily creates that sort of extreme. And I think it's, it's like the independent voter. Our hope lies in these people who are in between. And then the military's full of gay guys who want to be soldiers too. So there's there's that. It's complicated. I do think, though, that the generally held definition of a man as being a not woman and a not gay is indeed part of what all the violence against women within the military is about. I'm going to show you that you are unwanted, you are not like me, you can't stand up to me, you can't have a chance against me by degrading you in the worst possible way I can, and therefore I totally dominated you, so you are no longer a threat. And to ask people a threat to what, and is the important question.
I had a question while I was writing this book, and if we had been in touch at that point, I probably would have called you and asked it of you. It's not so much a question as it is a comment, and it, I think, develops from what you were saying. As you look at the narratives of men who have been in combat, have come back to tell their stories, they refer to themselves as grunts, and in the very ugliest of ways, and doing the ugliest of things, and they're encouraged to actually celebrate that. There's going to be a bombing of a village tonight, so let's go up on the rooftop with a six-pack and watch the bombing and get off on it. There's something really ugly about being a grunt that is very much owned when you are in the combat. I mean, when you're actually in firefights, when you're actually in situations where you're doing destruction, where you don't have a choice to think about, do I want to be this kind of person or that? There's this, what came out for me in one interview after another, one narrative after another, was these really very wonderful human beings talking about that period of time and what it was like to be a grunt, marching through the valley of death and fear no evil because we'll kill everybody in our path, these kinds of things. It was so grotesque to me listening to it and following it and seeing the contrast to who these people are as human beings when they got their humanity together, when they got out, that it made me wonder if, and that's really the most extreme, in my view, of hypermasculinity, this gruntness. It made me wonder if that's where, not exclusively, of course, because you've pointed out many different sources for this, but that's where the exclusion, the wanting to exclude women from the military, from combat especially, comes in. Because grunts don't like non-grunts to see them being grunts, if that makes any sense.
I think some of that applies even to embedded journalists, because it becomes a sort of ritual behavior among the men, grunts being infantry, all male groups, that they know they're, some side of them will know they'll be ashamed of if a certain light is, or later on, or a certain light is shone on them. Tim O'Brien speaks about this really brilliantly, and one of the things he says is about one of the reasons that soldiers can use such grotesque terms for the enemy and for the dead, like in Vietnam, Krispy Kremes for dead babies. He points out soldiers are deliberately brutalizing themselves and being irreverent about death and horror, to not just to make the enemy inhuman, we all know about that, but to numb themselves, to make the enemy inhuman, not just so it's easier to kill them, but so they don't have to feel it so much deep down what's happening. So he sees it as a self-protective thing. He also says, no soldier comes home innocent. No soldier comes home with clean hands. I'm not talking, I'm quoting him now. I just saw him in a conference and he gave a speech about this. I'm not talking about the the commanded kills, the bombing and killing. I'm talking about the little unnecessary sadistic acts that we do all the time to the enemy and to each other, including some of the torture stories that we heard coming out of Iraq, things beyond the call of duty, things that the environment of war itself and the peer pressure, let's not forget the power of peer pressure, will make otherwise nice people do these horrible things. And he said one of the problems with the way we treat veterans when they come home now is that we fall into this victim ideology about them, that they're victimized by, in Vietnam, hostile civilians who turned against the war, victimized by an incompetent and unfair VA system and military. And he says we forget that a lot of the self-loathing and remorse that soldiers go through is real. And they may be embracing the victim role because it's better to seem like a victim than a villain. But meanwhile, they're struggling with real remorse because of for all the little unnecessary horrible things they did, quite aside from that. I bring this up because I think, again, I guess because it gives me some hope for human nature, actually. I've spoken to so many veterans who behaved the way you just described while they were there and came home so full of hate for themselves for having done it. They did not manage to fully brainwash themselves. Just like studies have shown that in World War II and only 15% of soldiers were actually, and pilots were actually shooting to kill. Everybody else was purposely trying to miss. Because we don't really like killing people. All this gives me hope. So I mean, this is maybe fodder for the unmaking men part of your theory. It's already there to a certain extent. So yes, that behavior is ghastly, but I think the kind of guy who embraces it completely and stays there with feeling okay about it may not be as common as we think. Don't really know.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I've seen so much evidence of the transformation, and I guess hope is a good thing it's a good point right now in this program to be talking about hope, because you do get such a shot of it, a shot of hope, when you are talking with people who have come through it and come out the other side. When you hear Deborah Sweet with World Can't Wait has been doing a lot of work with Ethan McCord, a veteran who was on the scene right after the attack that came out, the massacre that came out in the WikiLeaks video. And in all of that, the WikiLeaks video being actually a typical day in war, because it's one incident, it's been treated as if it's an unusual thing. But as veterans, Ethan McCord, Josh Steiber, and others have said, this is what goes on every day. But Ethan was a foot soldier. He was on the ground, a ground soldier at that moment, and he comes in to the scene right after the shooting has stopped, and he can hear these children, these babies, crying. And he goes over to the car that's riddled with bullets. The father has been killed. There's a baby and a little girl in the car, and they've been shot, but they're alive and they're crying. And he says to himself, these children could be the age, these children are the age of my children, one of whom he has not even yet seen. That is that moment of human empathy that enters in the most, can enter into the most dire circumstance where you're out there on maneuvers, you're doing some of these, as you said, grotesque kinds of things, and then all of a sudden your humanity comes through despite all of the military brainwashing. They cannot wipe your humanity out of you, and that is where the hope is. And so he goes ahead and picks up these babies and takes them over to a truck, which he was not supposed to do. They're Iraqi babies, after all, first of all. And then he's taking them to a truck that's now got to take them someplace for medical treatment. And he's reprimanded for this. And he's told to get on and go to do what he's supposed to be doing. And he says, yes, sir. But that's a moment of transformation for him. Just that moment of these children could have, they're the same age as my children. Or the man who's in the group doing the house clearing and comes into a compound and finds the whole family sleeping outside because it's hot. And they're all under covers, but they're outside. And the old man of the family wakes up and totally frightened, and this gun is in his face. And the soldier holding the gun says, "This could be my family." That's that moment of hope again. That's that moment of that empathy strikes. And that's why I focused on empathy in the book. And then it's so much harder to go on and be a soldier after that.
Maybe we should open to questions.
Let's see what, let's extend this conversation.
Ask a question. Yes. I've been working on a film called Service, Disabled Female Veterans in Transition. I'm a big fan of both of you. And I have a question for you. The word family keeps coming up. And I was interviewing, first of all of the women in our film define themselves as disabled, either invisibly or visibly. And as I was interviewing someone last week, and this is kind of your question to I realized her military sexual trauma was experienced by her, I felt, I was just listening, as incest.
Yes, I talk about that in my book because, oh yes, the question was, if I can just turn it into a question, do women who've been sexually assaulted in the military experience it as incest? Absolutely. These are their brothers in arms. They have been, it's been drilled into recruits in boot camp, in basic training, that you've got to see each other as brothers and sisters. This is family. You have to trust each other, and you're not a gender anymore, and you're not a race, you're not a color. You're all soldiers, and you're all a family, and you're all the same. This is the language that's used, and there have been studies that have shown that sexual assault by people who are close to you, i.e. relatives, close friends, lovers, comrades, is much more traumatic than when it's done by a soldier, because there's a whole other level of betrayal. So that it makes it, I say it's like a mix. It's a mix of incest and, violent rape, and often those are the same things anyway. And then on top of it all, you have to keep living with the assailant. You can't leave, you can't run away, he can't run away. You're seeing each other all the time, and it can happen over and over again.
You talked about the kinds of dysfunctional families, often foster care, people looking for a family in the military. And I think this family model and this issue of boys individuating from their moms in a way that isn't so hideous. Can you address maybe this family model is where a bit of hope lies?
Is where the hope
post-experience.
I'm I need you to ask it, or say it again so that I missed something in what you were saying.
Perhaps aren't even aware of the fact that they're joining to become part of a family. Do you think that through their shared familial experience with all the horror and some of the brotherhood and sisterhood of it, that actually is an area for the kind of hope we talked about and redefinition of transformation because of something that
The family the notion of family in the military as a source of hope is, if we're looking for it, actually I don't think so. Actually, I think it's the opposite. When we seek out buddies, let's just stay with the term buddies for a while. Seek out a buddy. We seek out someone with whom we can have a genuine relationship, and someone that we not just is going to keep me from getting killed or you from getting killed, but who contributes to, we contribute to each other's growth in caring and in all kinds of ways, in our mutual interests and the things that we do together. What the family within the military shares, and the family in the sense that Helen is talking about it, or the buddy system, is death. The term death blossoms is frequently used by soldiers in combat. And so it's all around them. And I think, in my view, it's one of the most perverse things that intentionally, consciously, the US military does, is to create between human beings an insisted buddy system, insisted relationships that are for the purpose of killing. And I was talking with one of the mothers of a veteran who served 3 terms of tours of duty and works with Deborah Sweet and World Can't Wait, who said that when her son came out of the military, she explicitly and intentionally went out trying to get him separated from his buddies. Because as long as he hung with his buddies that came back from the war also, there was the reinforcement of what they had been doing in war. They didn't even have to talk about it. It's what they so much had in common. And therefore, an inability to heal at a certain level, an inability to address even the post-traumatic stress disorder, because there's a constant reinforcement of it. So it's probably family in the sense that feminists have been using it since the 1960s, when we were referring to the patriarchal family as the source of violence, exploitation, subordination, domination. I wish it could be the source of hope, but I don't.
I'd like to add to that. I have some complicated reactions. Part of me is that I know that veterans feel so alone and misunderstood when they come home, that they feel they really need each other as the only people who can understand them. And not only because they just assume civilians won't understand them, but sometimes it's protective on their part. They don't want to spread their trauma and horror to the people they love in their real families, and therefore make them have the same kind of nightmares and memories, so they lock it up. And they need each other to some extent, but it can backfire just exactly. It can also make them unable to move on. It really depends how they meet each other and who they are individually and in what ways. I've seen veterans heal by joining organizations like Wounded Warrior, where what they're doing is they're seeing other veterans in the context of helping each other, helping them people who are more wounded or more messed up than they are. So rather than perpetuating anything about that, they're not sharing bravado war stories. They may be sharing some guilt and remorse, but mostly it's Mikado, I'm not alone. You're not the only one having nightmares. You're not the only one who hits the floor when you hear a backfire in the street. I mean, that is needed. And then I'll say one other thing. A lot of the women who've been sexually assaulted, the last thing they want to do is ever see another veteran or another soldier or anything that smacks of it. They won't go near the VA because it still feels like military. They won't seek help. And I mean, some of the women in my book, I got 2 of the women together once because they both lived in Wisconsin. Both wonderful, darling people. One of them, the one who was the more traumatized of the 2, began to shake as we approached the other person's house, and there was nothing threatening about this other young woman, but she said, there's just all this hidden stuff, this unspoken stuff that goes on about, did you suffer more than me, or were you a better soldier than me, or were you one of those wimp women that made all the other women look bad, and I just can't take it, I can't take it. She's shaking like this. And actually, there's very little bonding between women soldiers. There's deep distrust between them. They're competitive with each other. You know, it's just like any oppressed group tends to compete with each other rather than bond at first. And so I've spoken to people who've tried to set up veterans' homes that are kind of half therapeutic. And the problem is getting the women to agree to live together, because they're so distrustful of each other. So family, it is not for them when they come home. Yes.
We'll repeat the question. Okay, maybe Steve.
It's related to this exchange of the return and the way in which there's this deep discomfort of the veterans and your idea about empathy. It seems to me that there's a huge, huge responsibility of the larger public. You know, one of the phenomena of a contemporary war is that we're not all in it. You know, it's a very small percentage of the whole community who goes through this. And they go through it because the rest of us, they're turned off. We can't even see it on the TV anymore. In Vietnam, we had battle scenes every night before dinner, you know. But that really troubles me. And I wonder if you think of that when you're thinking of empathy as the response. You know, how do we get that sense of our responsibility?
Oh, that is a wonderful question, because it is the thing that has come up. Since my book has come up as the question most frequently is, okay, so you're talking about empathy. How do we get from empathy to action? And it is exactly what you just said, that we are able to be more removed. Our president certainly wants us to be more removed and distant and disengaged. I'm in the process of developing and talking with Deborah Sweet also about this, a set of workshops that are going to be called Unmaking War Now, From Empathy to Action, where we're going to explore one's own experiences of empathy so that we can treat empathy experientially, not as a concept, not as a theory or a psychological something or another, but as something that we all experience. And then take that, excuse me, into what it looks like in combat, both for the soldier and for the soldier's victims, who are other soldiers, as well as other people, Iraqis, Afghans, and whatever. And in doing that, looking at the power structures, I'm describing the workshop right now, looking at the other at the power structures that that we have to be aware of when we're empathizing. This isn't just human to human. This is human to human, surrounded by a U.S. military, superimposed by a White House, with power structures and vested interests. So extending our empathy beyond that. The whole point of this is to look at empathy, to treat empathy as a means to action, and trying to get people involved in workshops where they will think about this and actually, instead of turning off the TV, because that's the other thing I hear, especially from women friends, I just have stopped watching the news in the last 10 years. Excuse me, it's like saying I've stopped caring about humanity, you know? And so this is, I'm hoping, going to be a way to actually encourage a re-engagement of people, which I assume is going to be an impetus to action, which would be the last part of the workshop, developing plans of action to address this anti-war situation we need to develop.
Yes, bravo. And that's all. It's also part of the reason I wrote this book and the play, and I have a novel coming out too, which is half from the point of view of a woman soldier in Iraq and half from the point of view of an Iraqi woman. We haven't had that yet, and they meet at a checkpoint, and they're both in first person. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier in my talk about wanting to bridge that culture gap, is because if we don't want soldiers to feel as if they're only understood by other soldiers, thus perpetuating the dangerous side of the family that Kathy talked about, then we have to take it upon ourselves as civilians to try and understand the best we can what they went through, so that if we can't empathize, at least we can really do a good job of sympathizing and listening to them when they're ready to be listened to, instead of just saying, oh, horrors, don't talk about that, That's why I want to give voice to the soldiers and make it accessible. And I don't write this with all the military jargon that civilians don't understand. That the military is such a secretive organization. It's such a club. Actually, I know this is perhaps offensive, but it's a cult. I mean, the way training works, I show in my book on training, is exactly the way brainwashing works in cults. They do all the same things. Sleep deprivation, shave off your hair, take away your clothes, give you a different name, don't let you have contact with home, etc. Break you down, that's what they say, break you down the civilian doesn't want to kill, build back up a soldier instead who does want to kill, and when it's all over, go home. Does anybody ever try and reverse that? No. Then you're left all messed up and feeling like nobody can understand you and being afraid to say anything because you will look like a monster and you feel that you are a monster. So we've got to open our eyes to this and listen to soldiers who actually have a lot to say, more now than in previous wars, because we're in a confessional culture now, and they've all got their YouTubes and their cameras and there's more readiness to talk if we listen.
But a part of that empathy has to go towards them.
Yes.
What they've done, carrying, and what they represent that the rest of us don't have to carry. I mean,
Exactly.
At some point, this has to get out of gender and go into the human condition.
Absolutely.
And do we really think that we are not capable of exactly the same things?
Right.
Really? So if we can't empathize with that side of ourselves as they carry us or us, I don't know how we're ever going to create what you're talking about.
And yet, if we're going to empathize with them, we don't want to do it to the extent where we're saying, necessarily supporting the ideas we don't believe in if we don't. I mean, that's the difficult part.
I think you can empathize and not judge it.
Yeah,
I do.
empathize and not judge.
Yes, I think you can.
And I think you have to remember that we all can empathize. I mean, that's not something that some people get to do, and other people kind of miss it unless they're sociopaths or something like that. Not something like that precisely. But that's in all of us, and that's why the subtitle of this book is How Empathy Can Reshape Our Politics, Our Soldiers, and Ourselves. And that's all together as a one. And it has to be, you have to be willing to listen, to hear the stories, the ones that we've actually gone out and gotten and recorded and written and are trying to bring forward, to break that isolation that soldiers are experiencing when they come home, which makes them even more reliant on the buddies from the war to have a buddy, to have someone to connect to, but to have that human experience. Because empathy is an interaction. We require interaction to be alive. The torture of Bradley Manning is the denial of human interaction to him. Solitary confinement has always been known as one of the worst forms of torture, because when you deny a human being the ability to interact, you are destroying their humanity. And it is torture. Empathy comes through interaction. I know how you feel because you have just told me this, and then I respond with, I know how you feel because this just happened to me. And we're interacting with each other. We owe our soldiers that same interaction, and we can do that while recognizing that what they had to do was something that the military and the White House put them into, and not have to buy into the system.
But we can talk, you read the first